Well, good evening, Raleigh Road Baptist Church. Tonight we are going to continue with our Bible study of the apostles, the 12 apostles, plus a few more who weren't of the original 12 who played a big role in the beginning of the Christian church. So far we have covered Matthew and Peter, and tonight we're going to cover a man who was not one of the original 12 apostles, but a man who did write one of the four Gospels, Dr. Luke. So let's begin tonight by talking about Luke's travels with the Apostle Paul. Paul had a very faithful friend named Luke. Now, Luke was a Gentile convert to Christianity. He was not a Jew, he was a Gentile, and he heard Paul preach and he became a Christian. He accompanied Paul on several of his missionary journeys. And although Paul, when you read the book of Acts, you discover that Paul had many traveling companions and co-workers during his mission journeys of evangelism. At the very end of Paul's life, when things had gotten risky in Rome to be a Christian, we find out that it was Luke who stayed by Paul's side until the end. One of the last sentences that Paul ever wrote testifies to the fact that Luke was there with him. The situation was this. Paul was imprisoned under some very harsh conditions. He knew he was facing his imminent death, and he wrote in 2 Timothy, what became 2 Timothy, with great sadness, because many who had been with him previously had deserted him. He wrote with great sadness about those who were seeking to kill him, both the Romans and the Jews, because he was a Christian. He made the comment in 2 Timothy 4:11, only one man was left, he said, standing with him. And Paul said, Luke alone is with me. So we see that Luke was to Paul truly a friend who stuck closer than a brother. Now the Holy Scriptures give us very few facts about Luke. In fact, we see that he's only mentioned by name a few times, 2 or 3 times in the Scriptures. We do learn some things about him from the writings of Paul. For example, in Colossians 4:14, we learn that Luke also stayed with Paul during his house arrest in Rome. He was under house arrest for about 2 years. We also learn from this same verse that Luke was a physician. He was Dr. Luke. Though Luke is not mentioned by name very much in the Scriptures, we can infer from the fact that what we read in Acts and the Gospel of Luke, we can infer that he was one of Paul's traveling companions. Now, as the book of Acts unfolds, the author is unnamed, but everyone is pretty sure that it was Luke. He uses what they call in English the first person plural at certain points. In other words, he begins to say that not just Paul did such and such, but that we did various things. By doing this, he is inserting himself into the story, but in an anonymous way. In Acts chapter 16, verses 10 through 17, he describes how he joined Paul's evangelistic workers in 49 AD in a city called Troas, and he went with them from Troas to Philippi. Luke decided to remain in Philippi and practice his profession as a physician, and Paul went on continuing with his missionary journeys, but down the road 8 years later, during Paul's 3rd missionary journey, Paul passed through Philippi again, and Luke decided to go with him a second time. From there, Luke and Paul and some other traveling companions eventually made it to Jerusalem in the spring of 57 AD. Now we notice here in the book of Acts that Luke stops using the pronoun we here at this point. But his detailed account in chapters 21 through 26 of Acts clearly implies to anyone that's reading carefully that Luke was an eyewitness to the activities of Paul, even if he was not a direct participant. So this is some of Luke's travels with Paul. Now let's look at Luke from the viewpoint of the beloved physician. For the next 2 years, as Paul endured persecution in Rome, he bore witness to the gospel before several high-ranking authorities who put him on trial for being a Christian. During much of those 2 years, he was in jail in the Roman port city of Caesarea. He was transferred from Caesarea to Rome to stand trial before Caesar, departing for Rome in the late fall of 59 AD. It is at this point that the author of Acts, again presumed to be Luke, resumes his first person narrative. He describes the dangerous sea voyage they undertook, including all the details of the harrowing shipwreck they endured, that finally brought the two friends to the capital city of Rome, where Paul was going to stand trial before Caesar. Now Luke closes his story by telling us that Paul, before he went on trial before Caesar, remained under house arrest for 2 years, proclaiming the kingdom of God with boldness to all who would come and visit him and listen to him. Now I might mention, and I may have mentioned this last week, when Paul did finally 2 years later go under trial before Caesar, the new Caesar's just a title, by the way. Like we use president, the Romans used the title Caesar for their dictator, their leader. He was not elected. I'm not going to take time tonight to go into all the ways you became a Caesar in those days, but the Caesar, when Paul and Peter and others came to trial during this time period, was Nero. And Nero has been shown to be a madman. He killed a lot of Christians during the time he was Caesar. So let's get back to Luke. So with what we've seen so far, was it really Luke, the beloved physician mentioned in the scripture, who was the author of all of these we passages in Acts? Well, this question must be considered in relationship to the authorship not only of Acts, but to the gospel that bears his name, the Gospel of Luke. Now, most biblical scholars today consider Luke and Acts not to be two different books, but a single 2-volume work. Not only are both books dedicated to a man named Theophilus, the book of Acts also refers to an earlier volume that describes what Jesus said and did, which is obviously the Gospel of Luke. Furthermore, we see that in both books, the same excellent Greek style of writing is used in both books. Similar themes are discussed in both books. So considering this evidence, along with the evidence we have used in part 1, again we ask, was the author of the Gospel of Luke and Acts the same man? Well, let's look for further evidence to the church's memories of Luke. You know, I talked to you in the very or we discussed in the very first lesson, that we get a lot of our information from church historians and the church fathers. Well, the church historians down through the years have almost to a man attested to the fact that they believe Luke to be the author not only of the canonical gospel, but a second volume that came to be called the Acts of the Apostles. Now let me take a moment to explain the word canonical. Canonical, C-A-N-O-N-I-C-A-L, comes from the word canon. Now I know you've heard the term canon. The canon is the 66 books of the Bible, 39 Old Testament, 27 New Testament. Most of these books had already been written by 120 AD. The canon was decided at a place called Nicaea by a group of church fathers and church historians at a meeting that was given the title the Council of Nicaea. And they decided which books should be in the Bible. There were a lot of books being written about Jesus. Some were true and some were not. And so it was decided in 325 AD that the experts on these books, the best experts, should get together and decide which ones were going into the Bible. And they decided on these 66 books, 39 Old Testament, 27 New Testament, and we call that the canon. Now, the earliest references to Luke's gospel are found in the writings of the church father. Remember, that's one of the pastors of the church, the Christian churches in those days. Luke's Gospels, the earliest reference to his writings, are in the writings of the church father Justin Martyr, about the mid-2nd century AD. That'd be about 150 AD. So that's the first time any church historian mentions Luke. Around 180 AD, the Bishop Irenaeus of Lyons, now he was also a church father, makes it even clearer that Luke was the author of both books. Irenaeus wrote, Luke, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by Paul. Irenaeus asserts that the we passages made it abundantly clear that Luke was Paul's companion and wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. So here we have the church historians and the church fathers chipping in their part in saying, yes, it was definitely Luke, the physician, Paul's companion, that wrote Acts and the Gospel of Luke. Well, that's the church history part of Luke. Let's look at the manuscript evidence. Now, what is a manuscript? A manuscript is any handwritten copy of a portion of a text of the Bible. Let me repeat that. A manuscript is any handwritten copy of a portion of a text of the Bible. It seems that a manuscript of the Gospel of Luke was copied by a scribe not long after 180 AD. There is one surviving remnant of this manuscript left today, of the original manuscript. It goes by the name of Papyrus 75. Now, papyrus, they didn't have paper like we have today. Papyrus was a very stiff type of material that they used to write on in those days. You've seen the pictures of the old scrolls. Well, those were papyrus. And the surviving remnant means it's a very small piece of the Gospel of Luke that was written by a scribe in 180 AD. We still have that, and it's called Papyrus 75. This is a very early witness, 180 AD, this is 150 years after the crucifixion. This is a very early witness not only to the Gospel's Greek text, but also to the identity of the man whom the church believes to have been the author the physician Luke. Now, some other facts about Luke come from other ancient writings. I've got 6 of them I want to go over with you. First, the ancient writings tell us that Luke was a physician and his hometown was Antioch in Syria. Second, the writings tell us that Luke remained with Paul until Paul was killed in Rome. Third, we're told that Luke was not married, he had no wife or no children. Fourth, we're told that Luke lived to be 84 years old, and he died in the Greek city of Thebes, Thebes, at the age of 84. 5, we're told that he wrote the third of the 4 Gospels, with Mark's Gospel being first, and Matthew's, we think, being second. Now, Matthew's Gospel was written, you remember, for the Jews, but Luke's Gospel was written primarily for the Gentiles. And number 6, we're told that Luke wrote the book of Acts after he wrote the Gospel of Luke. So these are 6 additional facts that we have from the early ancient church historians' writings about Luke. Well, we have a few other traditions about Luke. Mark and Luke, who wrote 2 of the 4 Gospels, were called apostolic men by the African church father Tertullian. Tertullian goes on to state that just as Mark got his information from Peter, so Luke got his information from Paul. So that's how these 2 guys, neither one who was with Jesus while he was doing his ministry on earth for the 3 years that he was preaching and healing people. Neither Luke nor Mark was with him every day like Matthew and John were, the other 2 Gospels. But they got their information from 2 people who knew Jesus well. Mark got his from Peter, and Luke got his from Paul. Again, we have some information from a church historian, Eusebius, man we've mentioned several times. In his famous book entitled Church History, that he published around the turn of the 3rd century, about 200 AD, he also has something to say about Luke. He says that Luke was of Antiochian parentage, which meant he was born in Antioch, Syria, that he was a physician by profession, that he was good friends with Paul. Now, we've heard all this before, but also it says he was well acquainted with the rest of the apostles. So Luke got to know all the apostles quite well, and I'm sure, although he got the majority of his information for the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts from Paul, I'm sure from the other apostles that he got to know, he got some information about Jesus from them also. Eusebius also wrote that Luke was the author of the Gospel that bears his name, that Luke was the author of the book of Acts. More proof that it was Paul's loyal friend, Luke, who wrote both books. Later on, church fathers such as Jerome and Epiphanius all agree about the authorship of Luke and Acts. This was never disputed. That's the point we want to make here. It was never disputed by the ancient church that Luke was the author of these 2 books. No other candidate was ever put forward as being the possible author, whether in the writings of the church fathers or the church historians or the biblical manuscripts. Now, I've really pounded on this, and you might wonder why we continue to attest to the many people who said that Luke wrote his 2 books, that Peter wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Peter, and that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew. Why do we continue to to just put out all the different proofs that these three guys wrote what most people believed them to have written? Well, it's because since the Bible was canonized, the 66 books were put in the Bible, there have been some people, some theologians, who do not believe that these men are the authors of the books that have been credited to them in the Bible. But the preponderance of the evidence, if they were on trial for writing these books and we were all the jury and we looked at the evidence, the majority of the evidence points to Matthew having written his gospel, Peter having written 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Peter, and Luke having written his gospel and the book of Acts. The weight of the evidence points to them. Now we will mention that as we go along, as we discuss others of the apostles who wrote books that are in the canon. So that takes us, believe it or not, only halfway through the story of Luke. Next week, we'll continue with our study of Luke by looking at his contribution to the New Testament, which is, of course, the Gospel of Luke. So next week, we'll look at what Luke did and how he did it when he wrote the Gospel of Luke. I hope you are enjoying these presentations on the different apostles. As I said, we'll finish up Luke next week, and then we'll move on to another one. That will give us, Matthew, Peter, Luke. That will give us 3 of the apostles covered by next week. 9:30 Sunday morning, we have worship service under the trees. Hope to see you there, and I hope you have a great week. God bless.